Good morning. My name is Vivian Eskin. I am a training and supervisory psychoanalyst living and working in New York City, Manhattan's Upper West Side. I treat individual, adults, teenagers, couples, mothers and babies, and I'm really looking forward to talking about our inner virus with Shimona Tzukernik, who I have grown to love and adore.
Thank you, Vivian. Hi, everyone. My name is Shimona Tzukernik. I live in New York and I work as a coach, course author for the JLI, and a motivational speaker. I have been very interested in understanding the link between Kabbalah and psychoanalysis, and Vivian has mentored and guided me. And I have come to love and adore her too. So welcome to our work and our exploration of the coronavirus through a psychoanalytic and a Kabbalistic lens. We hope that it will offer you insight not only into your personal relationship with COVID, but stress and crisis in general.
Amen.
So one of the things that we had been speaking about, that Vivian and I had explored, is what's the kind of ground zero, if we could call it that we want to explore this from. And there are two. One of them is the idea of light emerging from darkness. Now, mystically, this is a very profound concept. King Solomon says, I have seen that wisdom has an advantage over folly, over silliness or foolishness, as the advantage of light over darkness. Now, that doesn't just mean that wisdom is better than folly or light is better than darkness. The mystics explain that what King Solomon is speaking about is the idea that there is a light that emerges from darkness. In Hebrew, the words are Yitron ha'or min ha'choshech. The light that emerges, is not just then light is better than darkness, but light that comes from the darkness. And what Vivian and I have been speaking about is this notion of life in general being about the transformation of darkness to light. The Talmud, in fact, says one sees from the black of the eye. The darkest place in your body is the pupil, the black of the eye. And what our intention is to explore this darkness as a means to coming to light. Yeah. So, Vivian, your thoughts on that from a psychoanalytic perspective?
Thank you. We can't really find light unless we are coming out of darkness. Mm. And when conducting or thinking about human suffering and working in psychotherapy or psychoanalysis, the practitioner must cast a beam of intense darkness so that something which has been obscured by the glare of the illumination can glitter all the more in the darkness. And this is actually a quote from James Grotstein's book, A Beam of Intense Darkness, where he quotes Freud, Sigmund Freud, and Wilfred Bion. So I think the idea that we've spoken about is how do we create or find really a silver lining while the world is shut down right now. People are suffering, people are frightened, people are sick, people are scared. Businesses are shut down, families can't see each other. Other families are stuck in home working and trying to make sense out of the incomprehensible. This is unprecedented. So I guess, we spoke about how we will be covering some of these ideas that pertain to living in these dark times of the pandemic. So the ideas are also true as to what it's like to live with illness, depression, and anxiety on a regular basis. There are people who suffer daily, constantly, in their own mind. They live in a dark, dark place. So learning how to cope with the calamity of uncertainty, of isolation, interconnectedness and how much we need each other. The powerful component that you've taught me about prayer is necessary always, in everyday times and in calamities and in catastrophe. So today I think we'll talk about also the potential to inflict harm, that we all have a potential right now to inflict harm. We can be carrying something we don't know we have.
Mm.
And I think it's a metaphor for some of our own human tendencies that could be dark and competitive and envious and hurtful to others.
So I would like to just add, Vivian laid out some of the things that we're going to be exploring, both from a psychoanalytic and a Kabbalistic perspective. I do want to just step back into this notion of the beam of intense darkness, casting a beam of intense darkness, and to point out the power of the mind and perspective in terms of healing and how we cope. I think that the first thing we're trying to suggest is that, as a premise, the ground zero for the work that we're doing here in the workshop is that looking at darkness as bad is going to get us stuck. But if we can look at it not as bad or even as a problem or a challenge, but a growth opportunity, then that already positions us to do something different. You know, the mystics speak about one of the prayers tells us that God forms light and creates darkness. And what that is telling us, of course, creation precedes formation. You have to make something before you could form it, right? There has to be the clay before you can have the vessel, before it's been formed. So if light is formed and darkness is created, there is a notion that there is a darkness that precedes light.
Yeah.
It's the blinding light.
Yeah.
It's the light, if we could look at it metaphorically, that's inside the sun. You know, we don't see the sun, we are seeing what comes out through the corona of the sun. And this disease is the coronavirus. It comes actually from the Hebrew word keren. Keren means a crown, and this is a molecule that is surrounded by a circle, a keren of fatty acids. If you think about the sun, it's thousands of miles deep, but there is the circle or the crown around the sun, and the light that we're seeing is filtered through those gases. But the light of the sun itself is black. That's kind of what we're looking at. So that was our first basis for these items that Vivian pointed out, and I'd like to bring out one more. And that is the notion of parallels between our inner world and the external world. So, for example, in mystical thinking and Kabbalistic thinking, the word Kabbalah, which is mysticism, is actually etymologically connected to the word lahakabil, which is to make parallel, to align things. And I think that being aligned is possibly synonymous with health. That in the Garden of Eden, in that story of what happened in the garden, it's like a cosmic slip disc where the parts of us that are meant to be aligned are not aligned. And our work here is to become internally aligned. The memories that are stacked and layered on each other, the infant we once were, and the 2-year-old we once here, and the 12-year-old and the 20-something-year-old, all of that has to be aligned. And then there is the notion of the world at large. So the mystics call the human body a small world, olam katan, and the entire universe a large body, guf gadol. I think that's a very powerful idea, and it's something that Vivian and I have used together with the advantage of light that emerges from the darkness as a basis for what we're going to be doing, which is looking at these parallels between the intrapsychic, the physical, the global, and the the growth opportunity inherent in that. So, Vivian, do you want to begin by speaking about isolation and its impact for people?
So right now we're told to stay home. We have a new concept thrown out to us called social distancing. Keep 6 feet apart. Don't go to work. Don't see friends. Don't go to a house of worship. No bar mitzvahs, no weddings, no funerals, no capacity to enjoy, to work, or to grieve collectively. And it's hurting us. But we're also trying to protect ourselves. So there's an external isolation that we have to actually follow by decree right now. And every aspect of our life is hijacked, if you want to think of it like that, where we can't really, if we're in a moment of grief, we can't embrace it with others. It's lonely, it's isolated, it's by ourselves. If we're going through a joyous time, we have to postpone it. We can't embrace, we can't shake hands, we can't kiss our children, we can't even see our children if they're adults and they live at a distance. Or if we're grandparents, we can't see our grandchildren. They might infect us, and we're the vulnerable population. This can leave people feeling isolated, lonely, hopeless, despairing, more fearful, mistrusting of people walking down the street, of others, of their spouse, of their child, of their neighbor. There's a heightened sense of agitation and irritation, which can lead to feeling anger, feeling explosive about being deprived. I think that people who've experienced in their life early loss, which has to do with difficulties in infancy and early life by the hands of their parents, or a loss in their environment. It could have been a war, it could have been parental death, it could have been an issue of abuse or a depressed mother, something where they were at the mercy of those who took care of them and they didn't receive something very profound and important. These people have experienced firsthand what it feels like to live in an environment that doesn't feel reliable, that doesn't feel protected, that doesn't feel safe. We're all experiencing that now. When you grow up not feeling protected, not feeling that those who are caring for you are reliable or consistent or even abusive, you're going to grow up with a heightened sense of anxiety. You are not going to have a strong feeling of a sense of self. You won't have what we call containment. And people who have a lack of containment in their early development will suffer. They'll suffer from depression and anxiety. And without containment, one is more fragile, more vulnerable, more fearful.
I would like to interject something over there before we go into the concept of containment at a more in a more fleshed out way, and that is to address this notion of how individuals respond, because you're bringing up the fact that some people may respond in a way that is robust and some not, and this is going to be very much connected to their own experience growing up.
Yeah.
You know, when we had been speaking earlier, you mentioned this idea of the potential to inflict harm. And the other day, I had gone shopping for my children and could not come close to them. And I saw my son-in-law holding my grandson and having to stay on the curb and watch him.
Yeah.
Really brought up so many of these feelings that you're talking about, the isolation, the need for containment, for the ability to take care of myself in the absence of being able. It's almost like there's the vertical axis.
Right.
I always speak about
Excluded, you must have felt also.
how what?
Excluded.
Yes. You know, to me, I work with this notion of the y-axis is my relationship to my source, my creator, and my own soul. And then the x-axis, the horizontal axis, is interpersonal. And there was no ability to walk along the horizontal plane and approach and embrace. And so what I had to do is go inside and really play that vertical plane, the y-axis. Here I am at the center, the intersection of those two axes, looking up to my source and then caretaking my own soul. And so what you said brought that up for me, and the idea that individuals respond to crisis in different ways. There's what we have been given the tools, and we're going to go into that at greater length in a little bit. And then there's also information. It's very difficult to say how much information, how much awareness or consciousness is enough to push back or compensate for one's childhood. But I did just want to bring this out before Vivian goes into speaking about containment. Did you want to add something there?
I do. You're making me think about, one's temperament and how we're born into the world.
Right.
There are people who are born into such extreme situations of poverty, of abuse, and come out the other side. We're very resilient as people. So I don't think it's just the external environment, if it's good or bad, that's going to be a predictor for how somebody will fare in life. I think there's something about temperament. There's something about the impact of one's external family, not just family of origin, teachers, grandparents, what kind of school, what kind of learning environment. Right. I think to have the capacity or the opportunity to have someone in your life who really saw you as who you were, and as a child, as a developing, toddler, latency age student, someone who could see your kernel of, I would say, godliness and humanity and your realness is going to stay with you. And that is what love feels like, when you're really seen and accepted for who you are without judgment.
Mm-hmm. Right. When you bring up this notion of temperament and who we are, there is the role of the one who sees us and can function as the container. The picture is complex and subtle. I think that when God says to Abraham, go out on this journey, he tells him, leave your country and your birthplace and your father's home. At some level, he's telling him, you're born into a world of limitation. But who you are is infinite. And these are the limitations. Your country, so there's social, there's just societal. And that's quite external, And then there's the town that I come from, a New Yorker. New Yorkers have attitude. I come from South Africa. It's a whole different ball game.
Right.
There's that.
Right.
And then you come in, and then almost the most difficult, and I think that that's something you're bringing up, is my father's home, or the parental home, the nuclear home. Mentioned last because, of course, you'd have to leave your parental home before you can leave your town or your country.
Right.
But it's mentioned last because it's the most difficult one to emerge from. And I think that the mystics' understanding of leaving one's land is also leaving one's body. There's just your DNA.
Absolutely.
the kind of body you have. So I just want to add this, slip this idea in before we come to flesh out containment, which you'll explain, is this idea that in Kabbalah, there are lights and vessels. The light is what is manifest. The vessel is what contains it. It's more limited. So you can think about the sun, as we said, and the light coming out from the sun. There's your soul and your body, each one in relation to the other is like a vessel. But in the soul itself, there are levels. There's my ability to speak, to think, to do. Then there are my feelings, my emotions, that's deeper, and my thoughts that are deeper. But then there's consciousness, which is deeper than that, because it's beyond the letters of thought.
Right.
In times of crisis, our inner essence emerges. And that's something that is a great blessing. It's almost like the olive, you know, you crush the olive and the oil comes out. Something about what's happening deep inside comes out in a time of crisis. And there is the potential to generate an enormous amount of light. I think too, that if we're under stress or fragile underneath when the crisis presses, then that's going to come up too. And people may be feeling more angry, more rageful, more lonely than ever. The idea, I think that it is useful as a meditation is that we can, with a sense of containment, meet our challenges with equanimity. We want a sense of agency and control. We can self-soothe.
So much of this is about control, you know. Mm-hmm. There's such a lack of control. We don't know where this is, how we get tested, what's going to take it away, how do we heal, are we okay? We have no control over the economy. We can't go to work. And, you know, right now there's a whole rush. Hold on. There's a whole rush on toilet paper, right? People are terrified that they can't find toilet paper. And the toilet paper, in a way, is a symbol of, you know, loss of control, cleaning oneself. And using toilet paper and learning the mechanisms of the body for a toddler when they're going through potty training is the ultimate in learning how to control one's body and oneself and how to clean oneself. And right now, we're going through a regression and going back developmentally to that scared little child that doesn't feel control over one's body, metaphorically, and we're going to make a mess.
That is such a fascinating take. I mean, I have sat with this idea of asking myself, what's the toilet paper sprees about? And yeah, I think that when we're talking about leaving these constraints in order to face the world with a sense of agency and power, that's a really profound thought. So can you address for us this notion of where our different responses to crisis come from, particularly apropos containment from a psychoanalytic perspective?
Well, I think, first of all, some of our responses to how we're, you know, adapting right now has to do with what we were modeled. What did we see growing up from our parents? And look, you know, many of us have a history of Holocaust in our background, or war in Israel, suicide attacks, apartheid, 9/11, Hurricane Sandy, Katrina. There are catastrophes that we've experienced. How our parents, as we were young, managed this will have a lot to do with how our reactions might be, how our community around us manage this, we'll have a good indicator of how we might respond. And I also think the issues of helplessness, of vulnerability, of taking charge. There are people who look at the doctors and nurses today. Yes, they're trained to do this, but there are people who are putting themselves in harm's way to really help people. It's not just about the training that they have behind them. You want to think about what makes it different for them to even want to consider going to school and taking on a position like this where they could die by helping others. I don't necessarily have an answer to that, but I do think that for some of us, there is a calling. I think the calling is something akin to our own inner core and identity. And I also think that this has to do with gemilut chasadim and with containment.
And how would you, if you're going to address for people who are looking to respond with a sense of agency and peace, a sense that I can use this darkness to bring more light.
So every day we have the choice in this time, this darkness right now, we have the choice to bring ourselves some kind of light. How do we do that? We can make a choice every single day how we're going to structure our day, even if there's no work. Will we pray in the morning? Do we meditate? Will we take a walk? What will we do to make ourselves feel a sense of integration and calm and peacefulness? We can decide not to watch the news 24/7. We can call our loved ones. We can choose to cook, read.
Vivian, I want us to explore, for those who are listening, the idea of one's history, childhood, and containment. Not because looking at that is necessarily going to make me strong in this moment, but certainly, as we've spoken about, in order to be contained, we need to have had the experience of containment by our mother and father.
That's very true, but there are people who haven't had that, and I'll get into that in a minute. But part of the idea of containment, and part of what we have to do today to cope and to feel a sense of agency and resiliency, is to remember that we have choices. We have options every single day. We can use them productively and constructively, or we can choose to be destructive. And this is also the essence of wanting. You have to want to. You have to want to have a motivation inside, an intention to want to come, to want to be contained. And yes, we need to have had the experience of containment early in life. What do we mean by that? It speaks to having had the experience of being held psychically and understood in positive and negative ways. So for example, of being loved in spite of what we project outward. Babies, children project a lot of frustration, rage, despair, irritation outward. Their own bodies don't know how to function. It is really up to the caretaking figure, generally a mother, or it could be a father, it could be a grandparent, it could be a babysitter, to try to empathize with what it might be like to be that baby who's irritated, who's frustrated, who's projecting out all kinds of inner experience of discomfort and also a fear of dying. What do we know as an infant? who's going to care for us, where their next meal is coming from, if we're going to be fed, what wetness means, what it means to explode our body in some kind of, fecal matter. We don't have any understanding of what that is in infancy. But we do learn based on the reactions of what we're getting from the outside, be it the mother, the father, the caretaker, that something's going on that we don't understand. And they're taking it, they're receiving it. They're trying to hold us, to understand us, to look at us with a love and understanding, which is also like food. It's food that will generate thinking. It's food that will generate thinking and feeling that go together, that make for, okay, how do I figure out how I'm going to get through this bad moment?
I'd like to add something to this
Sure.
notion. You're speaking about the impact of our parents or primary caretakers on us as children. No one has the ideal situation, and unfortunately many of us have very difficult situations. And I have found in my life and in my work that to really stand freely and fully in the world, to be here as a autonomous, responsible adult who has a sense of being robust enough and hopefulness for the world, that requires that we play apart our physical parents and our divine parents, which would be the male and female aspects of God. In Kabbalah, this is the Holy One, blessed be He, and the Shekhinah. And one of the things that has fascinated me is that in the Bible, you will not find the obligation to honor your parents if it's not adjacent to the obligation to keep the Sabbath. Now, that is explained in one way as follows. The Sabbath reminds us of the first Sabbath, all the way back. You go back week by week. God created the world and rested on the seventh day. So the Sabbath bears testimony to the source of creation. Creation is six-sided. Everything in the world has a front and back, left and right, top and bottom. Six sides in everything that's physical. But seventh is beyond creation. And I think that the juxtaposition, the way I understand it, is that we could get locked in a humanistic relationship with our parents, and we are invited by that juxtaposition to think about the fact that God is a parent, that my physical parents are the parents of my body, but there's also the parent of my soul. And just to explore that a tad more, and maybe you want to share something about that, is that however limited we are physically, as I said earlier, we're born into a world of limitation, but who we are is not limited. If we can stay connected to that, if we can see beyond the earthly aspects to the divine and relate to our soul and our abilities, I don't just mean our emotional and intellectual abilities. I mean the soul itself going deep within. Then we afford ourselves more hope. And just to close that, I would suggest that as children, we need our parents. We need them to keep us safe, and by example of the way they choose to live, to teach us about God. So it is a bottom-up experience. Through my parents, I gain access to a sense of God and the containment of the parent and my source, my creator. As adults, we need a mindful relationship with God to begin to heal our childhood wounds. So, I think that that's something that comes up for me as you're speaking about these psychoanalytic aspects of containment.
Well, there's a whole, notion of how vulnerable and dependent we are. There's an interconnectedness today We need each other as children. We need to be taken care of by our parents. I think the ideas that you're talking about related to God are really important. I do believe that for some, not all, based on the example of their parents, if there was a, extreme degree of hypocrisy, for example, of some kind of abuse, of distorting reality, or physical issues, or incest, a child will feel not only let down by their parents, but let down by God. I do think it's parents who can forge the relationship between their child and the belief in God and faith. There's belief and there's also faith. Not everybody has faith. And I do think that I have seen correlations of this where faith in God has been destroyed by earlier examples of relationship, of how interconnectedness, vulnerability, and dependency was perverted or twisted at the hand of one's caretaker. So to be willing to forgive the caretaker, forgive the parent, and open up one's heart to forgive also oneself, and to open up a pathway to want to be connected to God and to community is so huge in the whole role of integration and healing. So you would have to face the disappointments, the failure of empathy, and not just talk about it cognitively, but really feel it in your heart before you can really allow yourself to feel integrated and have that agency and want to do good and to have faith again in the benevolence of God.
As you're speaking, the thought comes up for me that it's easier to fall down than to rise up. And failure at some level is natural. And transformation is the miracle.
Yeah, and how not to blame, It's very easy for us to blame when we're faced with adversity, or right now, everybody's blaming China, right? Well, what happened happened. It will not help us to blame. Or blaming God. How could this happen to us now? Purim was ruined. Pesach is coming. What are we going to do? Trying to think of it maybe as a test.
Well, in Hebrew, the word for test, nisayon, is related in sound to the word nasa, to elevate. The purpose of a test is to elevate one.
So if you could flesh that out a little more, what are you saying?
You spoke earlier about the difference between faith and trust. Really resonated with me. One of I tend to define that difference as faith is believing in God, and trust is believing that God believes in me.
Yeah.
Very difficult. And as you were speaking, I'm thinking to myself, how do you generate faith? Trust. Faith is natural.
Right.
In a sense, you could say it's our birthright, but how do you generate trust? I don't think it can happen without the individual, and I know that's something you want to get into at the end, so I'll hold off on that piece. But in response to your question, what comes up for me is this, there's a lot out there in the world at the moment about the power of positive thinking. Oliver Burke's book. What's it called? Something about happiness for people who
Right.
the antidote, happiness for people who can't stand positive thinking. I think there's a lot there that resonated for me, and as it aligns with mystical teachings, is this idea that when there is something negative, it doesn't mean that it hasn't happened.
What do you mean
Darkness,
by that?
bad things happen.
Yes.
And you don't just, have a manifestation board to get rid of it. Thinking positively is not the same as denial, although there is this notion of the power of positive thinking. So if we look at the idea of a test being to elevate, I think that there's a segue, there's an opening there. There's darkness.
The fact that you and I can have this conversation right now, and we come from different worlds, and there's something about curiosity that I think is healing too. I'm curious about you and what you know, and you're curious about me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So there's an innate sense of wanting to know something else.
And I think the deepest aspect of the test is surrendering, knowing that it's happened, but not knowing why it's happened. You were speaking about judgment and blame. So not being able to suspend. Am I big enough to fail? Having that sense that I am big enough not to understand,
Right.
and therefore I could surrender.
Right. So what you're talking about is allowing yourself to know that you're vulnerable and there is a strength in the vulnerability. It's not just a weakness. That you're curious.
And I am seeking.
You have doubt, and there's doubt. We're living with doubt and uncertainty. And I think the crux of life's mission is to learn how to live with doubt and uncertainty and feel strong.
Yep. One of the ways of describing God is nimna nimna ot, is the contradiction of contradictions. And we have to learn to live with that. So the test, the darkness, is this appears to be bad. There is what's happening, the facts. And then there's my interpretation of those facts and what the way I understand the why of it. But if I can submit to that and have a sense of I'm big enough to fail.
Right.
I am part of my creator.
And I will pick myself up and try again.
Mm-hmm.
And what's fail? It's a mistake. What does fail mean?
Well, the Talmud says, Sheba Yipol Sadik Vakam. A righteous person falls, not fails, falls 7 times and stands up.
Absolutely.
So coming back at it. And I think that when we are able to do that, we find in the test, or that through the test, surrendering, submitting to a higher power, and our inner self, that we have come to a new place.
Yes.
It takes so much time, and we fall. But we stand up and we find I am in a different place than I was a number of months ago.
Yes.
Or weeks or days even.
Yeah.
Although the change is probably slower. So I want to come back to this notion of interconnectedness that you brought up as a counterintuitive association with our vulnerability and isolation. You want to address anything around intrapsychic wholeness as a path to and a result of healing, because one of the things we're doing is looking at the global, but then also the inner. So we spoke a little about the interconnectedness globally, but what about the interconnectedness between our parts?
So in my work, I think one of the biggest obstacles that people have toward healing and getting better is to really surrender to the fact that they're a patient and that they need help. And although people might know it cognitively, they fight with themselves emotionally. So there's an interplay going on for a long time in the course of a psychotherapy on the ambivalence and conflict one has about one's own angels and demons on the inside. The angel wants to get better and wants to do good, and the demon wants to tear everything down and spoil the good and destroy for the pleasure of bringing down the house, for the pleasure of destruction. There is a sense of pleasure in building a castle and kicking it down. Think of a child with his Legos. So to know on a deep level that one is actually projecting something nourishing and good, let's say between a therapist and oneself, or between oneself and one's neighbor or spouse, one would have to allow themselves to feel vulnerable enough to understand and feel the pleasure of destruction. And then think with the feeling about where it's going to lead. To what end? Does my pleasure of destruction also destroy any opportunity for growth? Does it destroy the capacity to be intimate? To have a relationship? To feel good about oneself? So even though we might allow ourselves to know that we have this innate destructive feeling, to really work hard and allow oneself to try to move above that and to transcend it and to try to block one's potential to destroy, I think is the first step in healing.
Well, what comes up for me when I'm listening to you, you're speaking, as far as I understand, about the potential to inflict harm and possibly an unconscious desire to take down the house.
There is that, but there's also the potential to inflict harm has to do with something innate, and it also has to do with the envy of the other person who has the capacity to help you. That's where the interconnectedness and dependency comes in. We need each other.
And I think that the extension of that is that if we do need each other, then we are also very powerful.
Yes.
That it's not an internal delusion that I'm powerful. We are very powerful if we are needed.
We are. I mean, I have people who say to me, thanks for helping me. And I say to them, I could not do this without you. I need you too.
The whole world needs each one of us.
Right, but it's this journey together of interconnectedness and dependency and vulnerability.
Right. You know, you remind me of a beautiful teaching. It's a verse from King Solomon that speaks about God having placed the world in our hearts. It's ha'olam natan b'libam, placed the world in their hearts. And the way this is understood is that we each have a mission to repair the world, to make it lighter and brighter than it was before we came on the scene. And in order to do that, what's required is that there is an interconnectedness between our own inner being in our heart, our physical being and our heart and the world at large. And what that means is that if I want to change the world for good, the best place to start is by changing myself. And I think that that's a useful model in relationships as well. So there's the best, how do I create more peace between people? By creating more peace between my own parts. How do I help my spouse, or even invite my spouse into a place where he or she is willing to not kick down the house?
Exactly. I mean, I think when one does feel a sense of integration of all the parts of oneself, the hurtful, the bad, the negative, the envious, the competitive, the loving, the healing, we walk in the world without guilt, because we don't have an intention to hurt. We have an intention to just be. And that in and of itself is calming. You can tell, you can sense your senses. You don't have to talk. You can sense when you're in the presence of somebody who is together, who is integrated. Right. And it gives you a sense of protectiveness. There's a sense of leadership. In a sense that in the presence of this person, I'm going to feel okay. Mm-hmm. And I think in deep prayer, we also go to this kind of place.
I was going to, as you were speaking, bring up the notion of prayer, because I think it addresses two things that you're talking about. The one is that prayer connotes dependence and powerlessness. And on the other hand, prayer implies that you can change things. And that's a beautiful idea to be able to live with.
Yes, it is.
That we do it's a rough thing to think, well, God needs our prayers. But the way I frame that is that God chooses to be in a real relationship with us, to make us matter. And if we truly matter, then we have real freedom of choice. It's almost like God makes himself vulnerable. And I think many of us in our relationships have a notion that one has to be standing and the other lying. One standing, one lying. And when we look at our relationship with God, it's both of us standing. It's not that God exists and the world is an illusion, or the world exists and God doesn't. A meaningful life is built on the premise that I exist and God exists, and we are in service of each other. And I think that in relationship, it's like that too. So many times we think about it as one person winning and the other losing. And prayer seems to put us in that place where I am vulnerable and yet I have agency. And I think that that's what you're addressing in terms of isolation and interconnectedness.
Yeah.
All right.
I
So
was listening to Governor Cuomo this morning. Mm-hmm. And I was listening to an interview he did earlier in the week where he talked about vulnerability, how we're all vulnerable, and depending on being protective and on other people is a good thing. And it is our vulnerability that's our greatest strength. And it so warmed my heart to hear the leader of our state right now and city coming together and talking like this. There was something humbling. And it gave me a sense of feeling protected. I felt fortunate to be here, actually.
Is that like that notion, small is the new big, but in a very real and deep way? And that brings my mind back to something that you had said earlier about the beam of darkness, you know, that you create healing, and you have to do that by illuminating the darkness, but seems that
And
it's
grieving.
not through denial.
No, it's
There
grieving.
has to...
It's grieving.
You know, I am very much connected with the religious world, and many times I see people have an understanding that if you want to heal, there should be an ignoring. Now, I just want to qualify this, because as we come towards the end and just look at illuminating darkness a little bit, there is a notion of lahasiach et hadat, to avert your mind. It's very useful, because if we would just follow our mind, we would be slaves to our mind, and it's often going to be taking us down a self-destructive path. So there is a notion of averting one's consciousness and one's thoughts. The idea there is to make an appointment with regret, or make an appointment with the shadows, and maybe you can speak afterwards about demons and guides, because it's like there's a demon and our eyes look out, they don't look in. So we want to, whether it's with ourselves or with a therapist, make an appointment so that I can look at that.
Yeah.
And then there is the idea of patient, compassionate attention. So the idea of averting one's mind is go about your day and serve God with joy. Focus on the good. Like you said, what am I going to do today? I'm isolated. How will I connect? Will I pray? Will I meditate, etc.? And then make an appointment. Avert the negative, but then illuminate the darkness by resting, shedding light on your feeling. And maybe you want to address that, Vivian, in terms of seeking counsel, how to deal with those inner demons.
It's a big topic. You have to allow yourself to know that they're there. And that, yes, you know, with time, people heal and people want to do it on their own. I think it's, again, very humbling to take yourself and visit a mental health professional, such as someone like myself, and to make yourself known through the eyes of another human being. There's a sense of shame, there's humiliation. There's a feeling of, why does she know and I don't? I'm no expert or judge on another human being. I might hear something different that is illuminated by the darkness that my patient doesn't hear, but within time he will. But it's humbling to ask for help.
You bring up for me so many teachings. The Holy Baal Shem Tov says, the eyes look out, not in. You know, as you said, I'm not an expert on another person. There's a beautiful verse in book of Samuel where God says to the prophet, a person sees with their eyes, but God sees to the heart. And some of what you're addressing is the need for the involvement of both parties, the practitioner and the client or the patient. But the basic premise here is that our eyes do look out, they don't look in, just by virtue of not being me. If I'm in conversation, or there's another teaching, a person is close to themselves, so we're blinded by self-love.
Yes, but here you're also speaking to the important piece of what's healing about containment. It has to be commensal. It has to be reciprocal. I need my patient needs me. The infant needs its mother, the mother needs the infant. There is a
reciprocity.
Yes, yes. And without that, there is no relationship that could really be one that would be healing. And that's back to interconnectedness. That's back to doubt. It's back to uncertainty. It's also back to the light that emerges from darkness. You know, it is only with another do we find it.
You know, King Solomon says, if there's a concern in your heart, in a person's heart, let him cast it down, and a good word will make it cheerful. It's that, I think, gets to the heart of the therapeutic conversation. There's something healing simply in speaking to another and then having that reflected, being understood. It's like there's so much left brain interaction that happens, but right brain to right brain is what's been spoken, I think, where there's this healing of I can witness the shadows, I can witness the rage, I can witness the jealousy, and I can reflect back at you in the safety of this relationship, the containment that you're seeking, and teach you to become your own container.
Right. So, you know, it's a long road. It's a few days or weeks. And I think when I'm listening to you right now, I'm thinking about people's omnipotence and omnipotent fantasies. I could do this myself. And, you know, I don't really need anybody. I'm self-sufficient. And part of what we live today in this, you know, digital world, that on the one hand, thank God that we could use it and have it, and it's connecting us right now. It's connecting the whole world to each other. There's telehealth, teleconferencing, everything. But on the other hand, it also is something that could be used to excess, where people are completely living in their own mind and their own head and their own omnipotent fantasy constantly, whether it's gaming or pornography, or that's a whole other topic of addiction. But I think the important reference here is in the potential to inflict harm. You know, you're making me think about working remotely right now. I'm not in my office. And there are people who I work with who are, you know, quite upset that we have to work like this. And initially we're very angry. And I had a lot of thoughts that went into what I said to people around how I might be protecting them from the potential that they have to inflict harm on me, and protecting them from my own potential to inflict harm on them just by being the possible carrier of something. But we're all the possible carrier of something bad, because we all have this inner virus called our negative thinking, our omnipotent fantasies that lead us to destruction, our want to spoil, our addictive nature, our envy, our depressiveness, our negative thinking. We all have it. So in this social distancing, in this needing to be 6 feet apart, maybe we could also think about being socially distant inside of ourselves and being 6 feet apart from our inner virus.
That is a remarkable thought. I have found that the capacity to take myself out of myself, or to speak on behalf of a part, is remarkably calming, and it opens the way to finding new solutions.
Absolutely.
You know, that I can look at those aspects, the inner virus, and speak on behalf of it instead of be controlled by it and from
Yeah.
it.
I guess
There's
that's
the
our
capacity.
tikkun olam, Shimona.
Well, that is. I mean, tikkun olam is that you can speak on behalf of the snake. Really.
Tikkun olam, for all the people who don't know, is what? Repairing the world.
Repairing the world, healing and repairing the world. And that's what I was saying at the beginning about alignment in Kabbalah, that it's about bringing everything into alignment. So maybe this is a great place for us to come to closure. You know, you've shared with me that each word is loaded with such an element of time, and those listening may feel that it has to be fixed now. You know, in Hebrew, the word for past is avar.
Right.
The word for a transgression is avera. And the word for transition is la'avor.
That's right.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
You know, that there's this idea that if I stay stuck in the past, there is an element of sin there. Where sin is always lack. Avera is similar, it's not the same as the Hebrew word chet. Chet is sin means.
No, it's avor, it's to go past.
Right, to cross the boundary.
Right.
Or to stay stuck.
Which is exactly.
And not cross the boundary. And
That's
that's what we're talking about with this isolation. And so I think that this idea of the past and boundaries are inviting us to make a transition, and that we should not feel that we are locked into a specific time pattern. Time takes time. We need to embrace that and become patient, just like a mother has to be patient with the child.
Yeah. It also, I think right now our whole sense of time is thrown off with this being, staying inside, and one day sort of falls into the next. We're not really in our daily routine. And there's a feeling of agitation, even in our aloneness and in our space, because everything is off right now. There is something wrong. Mm-hmm. It won't stay this way, but there is something wrong. And we need to, I think, make space internally for the idea that something's off and it's okay. We'll get through it and it will be different. But for right now, it's off. And not pretending that it's a good thing. We might find a silver lining, but it doesn't mean this is a good thing.
Well, we don't experience it as a good thing. And we have to be honest about that. And set an intention that we will see the goodness emerge from that, and allow for the process to live our lives, and then gradually see over the course of living our lives that things get better.
Absolutely. And as we began today, you talked about agency and taking responsibility. And we have to take responsibility for ourselves. We're not responsible for others in this moment in time. We're responsible for ourselves.
All right. Well, Vivian, thank you.
Thank
you. Really wonderful having this conversation. For those of you watching or on the call, thank you for joining us. It was our pleasure to spend time with you and share some thoughts. We wish you and yours well, and blessings.
Yes, and things will get better.
Amen. Amen.
Amen.
Thanks. Bye.
Okay.